It's Don here from the board. Thanks for coming along and checking out this video. Today in this video, I'm going to be building, or at least completing the build on the missile pod. What exactly is the missile pod? Well, this is the missile pod. Now, of course, I will in a moment bring the screen on for my desktop view and we can have a look at it. But the brief history of the missile pod is that a colleague of mine at work has been working with me in regards to bringing an innovation idea to life, which is to promote the usage of macropads at work for everyday, repetitive use, regular use functions. And in order to help this concept along, I was talking about that it's possible to develop and design and very quickly and easily manufacture your own custom PCBs. And to demonstrate this point, my colleague came out with a layout and we got it produced, and that's exactly what this missile pod PCB is all about. So let's switch over to the desktop and check it out. So here it is. It's a very simple design. The squiddy logo is actually the logo that my colleague at work himself created, and so he wanted it on the silk screen, and we went ahead and put that on. It's got 4 blocks of 4 switches in each of the corners, and then there's 4 radial switches plus a central switch. Now, the reason why I say that I'm going to complete the build is because I've already put the diodes on this, and you can see on the back of that, if the camera will come into focus, that the diodes have already been put on. Now, the reason why the diodes have already been put on is my colleague at work has never actually done any extensive amount of soldering and didn't know how to build a macropad or kit, so I put the diodes on to demonstrate and show how I prefer to solder and sort of the level of soldering that is required rather than big fat joints or joints that would have been cold joints. So I didn't go any further than that because I didn't bring any switches of my own or my Pro Micro to the session, which we did at work, but he was able to actually complete the complete build of this pad from start to finish with no experience really of any sort in about 75 minutes. So hopefully I'll be able to finish the rest of this relatively quickly. There's not much to tell, except it's just driven by a Pro Micro. Of course, it's a macro pad, so it's 100% programmable. And what I've got today in front of me on the table is I've just got some Gatoron blues, 3 pins, so they don't have the legs, they're plate mounted. I've got a very simple laser cut plate that I designed to match this particular macro pad. It is actually ALPS compatible, and the switches, the footprint on the PCB is also ALPS compatible, and you may notice that there is actually resistors on this that are drawn because this is set up so you can actually have a backlit keys, but it's not turn on, turn offable. It's 100% on if you install them. Okay, so there you go, and of course there's my Pro Micro. So let's get cracking to finish the build. Now, ordinarily you would see that I would use my quad hands to actually mount the PCB at a high position so you can see what I'm doing. I'm not doing that today because I don't have PCB mount switches, which means if I put them in, the whole lot's just going to fall out. And if I hold it with any part at all, regardless, and I apply any downward pressure, the switches are just going to fall straight through. So I'm going to have to work on the desk surface. So I do apologize that it is going to be further away. That said, we probably won't have as much issue in regards to cameras going in and out of focus all the time, which is what typically happens on the quad hands higher elevated view. So right now I'm just going to put in my Pro Micro headers and then Pro Micro itself. Then I'm going to tape it down so that I can get the headers soldered in before I start putting in these switches. So we do that, of course, to make sure that the alignment is correct, and you can actually get your Pro Micro on later, because if the headers are put in at an angle, then you're not going to have a good time trying to put the Pro Micro back on when you get to that stage, because obviously the Pro Micro should be the last thing that goes on, otherwise you're not going to be able to get your switches on that are mounted underneath. So it's just a bit of masking tape. I like to sort of center it on the actual Pro Micro itself, make sure I lift it off any surface so that the header pins are good and they're just loosely forming there. Then I can just sort of give them a very simple lineup, make sure that I visually check that they're relatively straight. They seem to be okay. They're flushing down. We can see the headers there. And then I'm going to have to put it on something so that I'm not impacting the actual Pro Micro itself when I begin to solder. So I'm using my trusty TS100 that's booted up. What have I done? I've gone into some kind of programming mode. So let's just unjack that, jack it back in. I've been told that I should upgrade the firmware on it because it gives me more functions, it gives me more sort of usability, but to be honest, I don't feel I need to, because it does everything I need it to do relatively quickly, simply, easily. So I've got it currently set at, I think, 310. Yeah, 310. So just let that come to temperature. I've got my 0.7mm leaded solder. I think it's a 6040, something like that. I have actually been using this quite a lot because I've done a lot of builds recently, and I'm surprised at how little I've actually technically used across this whole spool. That said, I haven't weighed it, so I don't know how much is actually left, because the middle of the spool, the core, is actually still quite large. Now, lighting is not fantastic because I'm not actually using the overhead light that I had rigged up, but we'll probably survive, and the camera will obviously do a bit of white balance correction as well. Now, I'm not going to bother doing this as a time lapse, only because it is actually relatively quick-ish, I hope, and you're just going to have to listen to the background noise of what's going on. I decided not to really live stream this, only because it was once again very impromptu. My dear wife and child are actually out going to a function, so I'm home alone temporarily. That enables me to quickly pop on and do this build and do this video without not so much distraction, but I suppose risk of my daughter coming in and accidentally getting burned if she pulls on anything, or pulling PowerPoints out, or inhaling excess rosin fumes, so on and so forth. So working relatively quickly. It only takes a couple of seconds for each of these pins. Make sure that when you're soldering that you get a good amount of contact and heat, but you don't sit on it too long. Once the solder actually liquefies and wicks down, you'll see it actually sort of do this little sucking motion in to the pin. You know that's when you're going to have a good join, and you don't get this bulbous effect on it. Then you're pretty much good. Now, you don't need a lot on these header pins either, because they're so small. You don't want it such a large blob that it's actually going to bridge the pin next to it and cause you some shorting either. Now, you may notice on the back of this, probably wouldn't have really seen it in great detail because the camera wasn't focusing so well, but I actually have labeled the switch footprints as well for their position in the columns and rows, only because it was to help my colleague at work, who've never really done anything like this, learn and understand for programming and mapping purposes when he was doing his hex files and stuff. So if it'll come into focus, there we go. So you'll see in the top corner I've gone, you know, column 0, row 0, in the middle, column 2, row 1, column 2, row 2, in exactly the dead middle, and then all the way down to the bottom where I've got column 4, row 4. So it was really just to help him understand the mapping. Now, they look like they're okay. None of them seem to be touching. Right, so the real test is, if I peel the tape off the back, my Pro Micro lifts off cleanly, and it seems to be looking good. And I can take the Pro Micro off, which I've done, and I can drop it on nice and free. So there we go. Let's just take the Pro Micro off for the moment, because we won't need that at this point. Now comes switch mounting. So flip that back around. Going to put some switches in. Now, because this has actually got an Alps footprint in it as well, it is actually a bit loose on the left and right. So you can see I can actually shift them left and right, but it does actually hold in the right position once they're actually in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in my 4 corner switches, and then that way I can actually solder them in, and then that will allow me to snap in the rest and not be too worried about it. So let's put those in. Now to slide them around and line them up. There we go, that one's in, and beautiful. So that's all lined up. I don't need that at this moment. Now, because the switches are actually what's holding the plate, what I can do is I can actually press on the PCB itself to make sure that they're all flush. They're all sitting neatly and down as required, and then get on soldering my my corner switches in. As you can tell, I do live quite close to main roadage, which has been mentioned many times before. It's one of those things that does make it difficult to have a completely noise-free environment, but any big city life, I suppose, it's something that you have to contest when you're trying to create content. Even more so because the room here is very small. It is road facing. We live in a very small apartment. So yeah, just got to do what you can with what you've got. Can't do much else about it. Certainly not in the realm of earning big bucks with this YouTube channel. Not yet anyway. Right, so my 4 corner switches are now in, which seems to work well enough. Let's pop in the others. Now I'm not doing LEDs just because natively I'm not like an LED kind of person, but if you were to somehow get hold of this PCB, then you can always put in your own LEDs. Now, on that matter, if you do see this video and you are interested, then please let me know, because if for some reason or other there's a lot of people that seem to be interested and contact me and say that they want to get hold of this PCB, we can arrange for it somehow. Maybe possibly even through PCBWay's website, now that we know about their shareable function. So we can upload that file, the Gerber, and then people can purchase it as required. Or if there is a lot of interest in it, and I talk to my colleague, because obviously he would have to have input in regards to this, since it was his layout design, even though I was the one that created the PCB itself, it could be something that could be put on a vendor site like Kibio, similar to my Big Switch PCB design, or alternatively we just do it as a group buy thing and have them shipped out from Australia or another proxy. So if this layout is useful for you, just yeah, let us know. Now, my colleague already has this built for him, and he's actually programmed it for gaming purposes. I don't know what he plays, but he said he's using it for gaming. So obviously he's got some macros and he's got some movement programmed into it, because these switches in the middle, these radial 4, are actually fitted with, I believe off the top of my head, 175s. So they are a little bit bigger and they can be used for things like directional navigation. Did have somebody talk about that this would actually be really perfect for machine movement. So they've got a CNC where they have to have manual movement of the arms in certain scenarios, and it's a bit clunky because the keyboard controls aren't sort of intuitive or together. Whereas if you flash this, so it's up, down, left, right, and then maybe, you know, rotation keys or depth keys, things like that, then that would actually work out all right. So that's what it's going to look like once it's finished, which is pretty cool. Squiddy there picking through that light blue plate. So once again, let's flip her over, make sure that all the switches are down firmly, and let's get cracking. we can finish this pad. Now, of course, these switches in the middle where the Pro Micro are always a little bit tricky, but a bit of patience, a bit of practice, a bit of self-control makes them short work. Of course, having straight solder also helps, rather than a bit of the end of the solder all wiggly and bent, making it a little bit difficult. Must say, recently I did a bit of work with my solder pult that I bought a couple of weeks back, and I've never really had to do a lot of desoldering work. I have now, and it is like the best, $30 odd including shipping that I've ever spent in this desoldering space. Because my old Durotech J-Car thing it did the job, but it just wasn't fantastic. But now that I've actually got the solder pult, so much easier. Almost, I would say 90% of the switches that I pulled were single shot solder removal. Just phenomenal. Just absolutely phenomenal. Quick work indeed, and very reliable. I mean, I did have to empty them out a little bit more regularly, but I think that's because of the fact that I was actually able to draw all of that solder out in one shot, that it was actually building up the amount of solder, and it was quite a lot. Silence going on there because I'm concentrating, but yeah, I would like to say a huge thank you to all of our supporters, both for people who just send us kind messages, those who've been involved on our Slack group. If you want to get involved on our Slack, just send us a message, send us an email to theboardpodcast@gmail.com, and I can send you an invite to our Slack group as well. And also, of course, to all of the people who are actually supporters of our Patreon. Without all of you guys, plus our sponsors themselves directly, while the show is still able to happen, because we would certainly make it happen since it's our hobby and joy, it's nice to be appreciated, and it does give us a bit more finance to do things like getting custom PCBs made. So, yeah, really, really appreciate it, everyone. And I hope that we'll be able to continue to rack out fun, different, interesting builds, things, designs, discussions, all about mechanical keyboards. We're in the home stretch. Another 3 switches to go. Yo. 1 switch to go, not 3. Ow. That rosin jumping, that splutter, really stings. Right, so just a sanity check that all of our switches are now soldered in. Right, so they're all in. Fantastic. And then finally, that stung a little bit. Let's get the Pro Micro on. Come on. You can do this. Excellent. and it's the best way of approaching this. Let's just turn that a little bit, clean that off, and here we go. I've got a bit of a bridging situation happening here, so just heat that up and wick that up. Let's heat that one up and wick that one up. Right, yeah. So got to make sure that your joints aren't going to bridge, otherwise you're going to have a unpleasant time trying to troubleshoot without realizing it. Right, so let's flip that around. Now I saw on one-up keyboards that Pete's taking solder cam to extreme heights now. Not only has he got solder cam, he's actually got solder cam in 3D too. So that's it's pretty hectic. I already know that some people were watching solder cam and they get a bit sort of motion sick because of the way that the actual cam dips in and out of the actual visual field. Since you're actually following the movement of the soldering iron going in and out as well. I think if I had a solder cam on mine, I think that'd be a bit weird for some people because they'd constantly see me cleaning the tip off into the brush and the movements are very quick. But it's nifty that he's actually experimenting with 3D. So always pushing the boundaries over there at one-up keyboards. Three more to do. Two more. One more. And I believe we're done. So Pro Micro is on. Now I'm just going to retouch up every one of these joints to make sure that they're settled in. And also I'm going to pull any excess up each of their respective pins. Try and reduce any likely chance of contact that's happening here. It's just a habit of mine to reflow. I know that it's not something that everybody does, and I just had an interesting experience when I did one of my Pro Micros on the Gherkin, where I actually had cold joints on the Pro Micro pins. So I now have a habit of just going back and reflowing it because it will save me potentially headaches when I know that it's not going to be on the Pro Micro that's part of the problem. Okay, done, and done. So what I'm going to do now is just unjack my iron. Just going to give it a bit of extra solder. I'm just going to rotate that off as it cools. Now it's just burning off all that rosin because it is actually quite hot, 310 degrees. And as that cools and settles down, it's just going to coat my tip with a protective layer of solder from what is going to be essentially the elements in the environment. Reduce any potential corrosion of the tip by giving it that layer. It's starting to foam a little bit. Now, the only thing that's left really is to flash it. I don't actually have a hex or a JSON for it prepared, so I'm actually just going to put the standoffs and screws on it, put it together, and then I'll probably get it flashed at a later stage once I actually figure out what I want to do with it. Our capability demonstration is still being worked upon at work, so I may actually take it into work and it can be another one of the test pads for people to be able to have stuff put onto it, and then they can use it at their desk and, you know, test the, I suppose, the functional usage of this macropad. But other than that, that was relatively quick. We're looking at what, 26 minutes at the moment for this video, so probably would have taken me, I don't know, 10 minutes to actually bend, insert, solder and trim all of those diodes. Probably, yeah, maybe 45 minutes, something like that. And then a couple of minutes still to go for actually putting this together. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Is that right? 3, 6, 7, 8. 8 screws. And now I need 4 standoffs. So these are M2s. You can, of course, complete this kit without the use of plates if you've got some PCB mount switches, because you can see I've actually created the M2 standoffs on them natively as well. So let's crack that open. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now these are 12mm standoffs. You could probably get away with 10mm if you really wanted to. I just have 12 because I like to have a bit of space there. It also adds a bit of height because the 12 spacing kind of makes it about a ½ inch off the surface, which is not a bad, I suppose, distance to have on it. Let's drop that screw in. Actually, I won't need the screwdriver for the moment. Rightio. Now, make sure that these will line up to the right spots. Okay, so let's drop that first one in, and we'll use the screwdriver. Give it a light tighten. Now, because these are acrylic, even though it's 3mm thick acrylic, you never want to over tighten them because you will potentially crack the acrylic. Well, that right on 30 minutes, just as I'm tightening these babies up. And we're done. There is the missile pod. So with Squiddy looking through, you can see the Pro Micro and Squiddy in the bottom there as well. And you've got heaps of space in between for your actual your cable. Now you'll notice that I said 12mm is perfect, and look at that, 12mm is perfect without requiring trimming of the Pro Micro. It just sits up just short, about 1/2mm short of that bottom plate. So if you went with 10mm, it's doable, but it just means you will actually have to trim the legs of the Pro Micro to make sure that it actually fits. So I'm lazy because every time that I've actually trimmed Pro Micro headers and whatnot, they're all sorts of funny angles and it just doesn't look nice. So I'd rather leave it fully on. And it also makes it easier because now when I do want to actually flash it, I can just get in between with the screwdriver and touch those contact points. Because otherwise, if it's really tight, it does make it difficult. Now this is actually a fat screwdriver. It's not getting through. Whereas if I use a skinnier one, something that's a little bit more traditional, then easy for me to just get in and touch that. Of course, if I do get a button or something like that, I can solder the button on, which would make it easier to also tap and reset. Right, and that concludes the building of the missile pod. Of course, if you're interested in getting one of these sort of layout macro pads, this particular one, let me know in the comments below or send me a message. And of course, if there's enough interest, then we can be looking into potentially getting some done, getting a bunch made, having a group buy, or whatever it is that is required to make it happen. Now, if you like this video, then of course, please hit that thumbs up like button. If you are new to our channel and this is the first time you've actually come here and you've seen our stuff, then we'd love and appreciate your subscription to our channel. Would help us a lot. If you've never come across our podcast before and you're into listening to podcasts when you travel to and from places, or just something to listen to while you're doing something else, washing the dishes, doing the laundry, building a keyboard, then please head over to our podcast, which can be found at www.theboardpodcast.com. Now, we have a whole bunch of people who've been really great in supporting us on Patreon. You can find us on Patreon, just search for The Board Podcast. And of course, if you feel like just giving us a once-off appreciation, you can always buy Kevin or myself a coffee by using the link below in the video description to send us a coffee. There you go. Thanks very much, of course, for checking out the video. And as always, until next time, happy clacking.